bloom is the last light of the gods.
The sacred bloom traveled, and my dreams traveled with it.
It is unspeakable power. Whatever you dream, you will have.
It's too late to change what has happened. But not too late to change what will be. Why bring me here?
We all have masters to serve.
She will know sorrow.
Our people have suffered long enough.
I am enlightened.
This night is not yet done.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cherry the Geek TV. I'm Joe Vinorni. The Spine of Night is a new ultra-violent epic fantasy animated film aimed at adults, and it's set in a land of magic. It follows heroes from different eras and cultures as they battle against a malevolent force. It's got gore, it's got nudity, and it's old school rotoscope animation style, and it harkens back to the cult animated films of the late 70s and early 80s, films like Heavy Metal and Ralph Bakshi's American Pop and Fire and Ice. It's currently available to buy or rent on all your video on demand platforms. And today we are joined by three of the people responsible for this madness. We've got Morgan Galen King, who is the co-writer, co-director, and lead animator. We got Philip Gelatt, who is the producer, as well as the co-writer and co-director. And then we've got one of the voice actors. He plays the Prophet of Doom. He's also indie horror film royalty. It's Larry Fessenden. Larry, Philip, and Morgan, welcome to Cherry the Geek TV.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. You're welcome. We'll start with Morgan and Philip. Talk about the genesis of the Spine of Night. How did you two get together? Did you know each other beforehand? And how did the project get its start?
Well, I'd been working on short films, like rotoscope animated short films, for a couple of years at home back when I lived in Philadelphia. And the third one of those was a short called Exordium, which vaguely made the rounds back in the day in 2013, in certain fantasy circles of the internet, which made its way onto Phil's email, I presume, and he reached out to me.
Yeah, it was sent to me by a friend of mine. I at the time hadn't worked in animation at all, but a friend of mine, but I knew a lot of animators for some reason. I don't know. I just always have. And a good friend of mine who works in animation, he was working on Venture Brothers at the time, saw Exordium and was like, oh, this is probably something you would like. It's, gory and strange and rotoscope animated. So he sent it to me, and I indeed loved it. And as Morgan said, got in touch with him and said, do you want to make more like this? Like, should we work together? Would you work together? How can we do this? And that was really the genesis of the film.
Now, it's a fantasy film, adult fantasy. I mentioned in the intro, harkens back to films like Heavy Metal and Fire and Ice. Talk about those fantasy films from the 70s and 80s. Were they big influences on you as kids? Were you always a fan of that style? What is it about that fantasy type film? Because they don't get made anymore. You don't see them very often.
Sadly, no.
Yeah.
Sadly, no. They defined my childhood, really. I was born right in the window where, pretty much everything was circling around that general aesthetic. It was like Thundar and He-Man when I was really young, and The Black Cauldron came out, Disney's last good film. And that's my hot take. That whole era was really a big deal for me. The Hobbit was one of the earliest VHS tapes we had, and then Bakshi's Lord of the Rings. My mom was a librarian, so it was back before people were even buying VCRs. So they had one that you could rent from the library, but the stipulation for libraries to have VHS tapes to take home was that they had to be based on books. So like the loophole to get something fun as a kid was the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and such. So it was the whole spectrum of what I was first watching when I was first watching anything.
Philip, how about you? Are those
Oh,
influential?
yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, my first memory, so like I'm from a small town in Wisconsin, and so my early memory of this type of artwork actually comes more from like going into comic book. Like, there were 2 comic book shops there when I was growing up, and they had like Marvel stuff, but then they also had like a rack of heavy metal and like other weirder shit. So my earliest memory of it is seeing it there and just having it sort of burned into my mind without ever having opened an issue of heavy metal. And then later, my dad, I don't even know, I think he just knew I liked heavy metal music, but when they finally put heavy metal back onto VHS in the 90s, right, he bought it and was like, oh, you'd probably like this. And indeed I did. But other than that, I mean, fantasy, I grew up reading Conan and Tolkien, and anything fantasy has always been my jam. So
Larry, did those types of films influence you when you were growing up? The animated fantasy type films?
It was a little more tangential. I was into horror and the classic Universal movies, and then whatever iteration over the years, the 60s was Hammer. But I remember seeing American Pop in the theater, and I loved Ralph Bakshi because I always liked animation and everything from the Fleischer Brothers, Popeye, and stuff onwards. In other words, way past my youth, I was still interested in that. And then I love stop motion animation. So it was all in my wheelhouse, and it was just amazing when these guys revealed that they were toiling away on this old school technique, which I had a lot of fun for.
Now that technique's the rotoscope animation styles. Now, some people watching this will know what that is, but for those that don't know, explain what rotoscope animation is.
On the basic level, it's when you film live action reference footage and then use that as a reference for each frame of animation that you're doing. Often directly on top of it, so that you can match like human proportions and human movement speeds. There's a lot of different ways it's been applied over the years. Like a lightsaber is technically rotoscoped, at least in the old days. And that's very much, we did it as close to the old-fashioned way as we could, still using a computer. So it's drawn by hand, it's frame by frame. It's a very laborious process.
Some of the newer, I guess there's a few newer films. The Scanner Darkly is a good example of a newer rotoscope style. Yours is a little more old school though than that one. You're doing more hand drawn. Where I think that was probably more computer.
Yeah, I think theirs is a hybrid. It's like done by AI or done by computers, and then they clean it up manually. I should get them to explain it to me sometime, because I'm not entirely sure how it works still. But yeah.
So there's different styles of animation out there that people do. There's CGI. There's all computer based animation. There's cell animation. What is it about the rotoscope style that appeals to you as artists? What's the aesthetic qualities that you love about it? What are the pros? Are there any cons? Like what are, like, now that you've done it, are there any negatives to it where you say, oh, maybe this is why they're not doing it anymore? Talk about, as artists, the process.
I mean, I think every style is going to have a trade-off of some sort. I think the advantages of rotoscoping there's a lot. I love how it feels like real people, so that when they are in danger or when they are injured, It doesn't. It's not like an anvil bounces off of their head or they get run over by a steamroller. Although, I mean, it'd be fun to do a steamroller. But but like they take damage. They are injured by the world, and they have like a physical bodies, which so they can feel, I don't know, sexual or scarier, or I think it carries a lot of things that are conducive to adult animation, which is I think why it's been used so much historically. I mean, even as Scanner Darkly is going for a much more adult, realistic quality to its characters. The drawback is definitely that it is time consuming, and because you don't have a lot of the time saving methods that you would get with traditional cartooning or other forms of animation, where it's abstracted from reality so far that you can get away with anything. So keeping there's just aren't a lot of shortcuts if you're trying to keep the characters functioning like the reference actors did. There's also a lot of being able to work with actors. You get all the amazing touches that they bring to the physical performance as well as the vocal performance. So there's all sorts of things that like I just wouldn't consider as an animator like that an actor will bring to a character's performance. And there's a lot of advantages. I'm proselytizing for rotoscoping. You were also able, because you shot the whole thing in live action, to then edit an entire, unwatchable to anyone but us, but an entire edit of the film before a single frame was drawn. So like that ability to control the edit that, like what would be the animation that tightly is not really reflected in other forms.
Now, you've mentioned that this is a laborious process, takes a long time. When did the film start? How long ago was it that day one? When was day one of this project?
We started, day one of official production was like when we started shooting live action was April of 2014, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we finished whenever we finished, like basically the beginning of this year, we were still making final tweaks to the animation. So, 7 years. Yep.
So during that time, for example, how long did the live action shoot process, that part of it take?
We shot for almost exactly a month. I think it was like 3.5, 4 weeks.
And then you edit it together. How long did that process take?
We, if I remember correctly, we like quote unquote locked picture. I think in June or July, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that's about 6.5 years of animation.
Yeah.
So that's a long time. How many days a week did you work on this, and what were the hours like? Let me back up a second. Most animated films, the big studio films, the Disneys and your Pixars and your Illumination studios, they have crews, animation staff, hundreds of people. They have teams of people. Each team works on it, has a character that they're working on. They have teams that are working on the backgrounds. What was your team? How many people did you have animating your film?
At any one time, it was me and 2 other animators. So just the 3 of us. The other 2 worked full time, and I worked, as my wife will attest, every available minute that I could. So I mean, it was.
So what would you guess, like amount of hours per day?
Oh, probably about 12.
Average. About 12 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
For 6.5 years.
Yeah.
See, I want to applaud you for that.
Well, I mean, it's unhealthy. No one should do that, But it was like the thing I wanted to do. It's such a lucky opportunity to both have. I mean, my wife was there supporting the whole thing. Phil was supporting the whole long production. Much longer than I thought it was going to take. And so it took everybody. So it's like it was both an obsession for me, but also I didn't want to let anybody down. We'd all invested so much time and effort into this already.
So during that process, it's a long process. You're living and breathing this pretty much, all hours of the day, every day for years. Was there at any point during the process where something changed, like you're like, oh, now that I'm thinking about it, now that I've spent years thinking about this, I want to maybe tweak this scene, or I want to change this character's look? Did that happen at all? And by that point, is it just too late? You can't, you're stuck in the process. Were there any moments like that where you wish you could have changed it?
Well, I mean, as much as it's locked in, animation's also just very flexible as a medium. So it was really an issue of like, can we spend the time on it? One of the characters in the first section of the film has his face melted off. It happens a couple of times, but the first time someone gets their face melted. And it was one that we just kept revisiting and revisiting because it had to read as gross the minute you saw it. The idea, you have to look at his face and be like, his face is horrible. And so like that was a thing that was, 2 years, every 2 years we're like, we could make this better or worse. If we could just keep pushing how gross his face was. So I mean, like, that sort of revision process happens, and I think we all were just better animators by the end. So like, I had to go back and find some shots that were, stood out to me as weaker that we'd done, 6 years prior, and polish them up, to the higher standard that it evolved into. So there's a lot like that.
Were there any scenes that you had already animated that ended up getting cut after the fact?
Very little. The original cut we had was so tight because, I mean, it takes about 1 day to draw 1 second of footage. So, if you cut 5 seconds off of a scene, you're cutting out an entire work week for somebody. So, we were very careful. Like, even when we did have to cut something, I always tried to repurpose it, like put those characters in the background somewhere to fill in a crowd, or, find a way to make it work somewhere else so that nothing went to waste. A few things didn't quite make it, but.
How into the process is it when you record the voice actors?
It was pretty late. Well, year 5 of 6 is basically when we started, or year 5.5 basically is when we went and cast the voice actors, and when Larry came on to be the most amazing Prophet of Doom ever put on screen.
So let's talk about your voice cast. We'll start with Larry. Larry, you are the Prophet of Doom. That character doesn't sound pleasant. What can you tell people about the Prophet of Doom, and how does that character fit into the story of The Spine of Night?
Well, as his name attests, he's a naysayer and somewhat hysterical in the town square. I'm trying to warn everybody of the oncoming darkness, as it were. But, these are really fun characters to get. And you kind of know the tradition that you're in, and then you get to look at the picture, in my case. And so you have a little bit to work with, and so it's directing. We had a lot of fun. I actually got to improvise because my camera's off, and my guy's off camera as well. So riffed a little bit, and some of that maybe check. I overmodulated on the mic out of enthusiasm a few times. So we did it all. It was really great. It's very fun to be brought into this project. It was so clearly a labor of love, and there's some real name actors, as I'm sure you'll mention, but it was fun to have a little
guys, talk about your voice cast. You have some heavy hitters in there: Richard E. Grant, Lucy Lawless, Patton Oswalt, Betty Gabriel, Joe Manganiello. How did you get? This is your first film, right? And how do you get a cast like this to come on board? What was the process of getting these people?
Well, I mean, so part of it was being like, you're always curatorial in who you go to cast, right? Because this is part of the nature of the what you're doing. But in this case, we tried to approach people who we thought would get the genre. Like, so Joe Manganiello, for example, clearly knows clearly loves dark fantasy. Patton Oswalt is a self-identified nerd. Richard E. Grant, I have to say, I feel incredibly lucky that he came on board. I don't personally know whether he is a nerd or not, but he like, as soon as we offered it to him, he said yes. And I mean, he brings such gravitas to that part. I mean, I can't imagine anybody else doing it. He's so stinking good. And Lucy as well. I mean, she came on, watched it immediately, was like, oh, I definitely want to do this. And then she tells the story, so I'm not telling anything out of turn, but she said she wanted to do it. And then one of her reps told her that she shouldn't do it because of the way the character is drawn. And she shouldn't take it because people shouldn't see her that way. And she was like, screw you, I'm Lucy Lawless. I will do the parts that I want to do. So all of them, Larry obviously included, are fantastic, so much fun to work with, and all brought so much to the project, I have to say.
How'd Larry come on board? Did you know Larry ahead of time, or is he somebody that you just how do you approach him?
We had never met, and we were thinking about the Prophet of Doom, and I think it was Morgan's idea, I believe, to approach Larry, and then it became. I mean, I don't want to typecast Larry, but I just feel like it just was obvious that he would do just a fantastic job with the part. So we just wrote him an email and we're like, hey, we're doing this crazy thing. Do you want to come yell about the oncoming doom of civilization for a little while for us? And he graciously said yes. So,
and Larry, when they contacted you, was it just the story that they had told you? Did they have samples of the animation? Like what did they present to you about the Spine of Night, and what about it intrigued you and made you want to jump on board?
I always like coming on to things that seem unusual and that are being done out of some additional passion and not just kind of being churned out for the dollar. Because I know the sound studio that was working on it, I actually got a glimpse of the whole process. I saw, I think maybe some of the animation was cut in with the original shoot, just whatever. It was clearly a behind the scenes thing and they were already working on sound design. So I just got a glimpse of the whole process in a brief afternoon and thought, oh, well, that's so cool. And I knew one of the other voice actors who's also a sound designer. So it just was one of those things, a lot of this level of showbiz things happen because of one person knows someone else and a recommendation's made. So that was how it happened for me.
I want to talk briefly about the score to the film. I think it's a really awesome score. There's hints of the Conan the Barbarian score that I picked up, unless I'm imagining it.
You are not imagining that, no.
Talk about how that score came about and what you were going for.
Yeah, so very early in the process, because the film is broken up into different, time periods, we had thought that it would be awesome to approach different composers to do each of the different sections of the film. So we ended up doing that, which was really interesting and just a lot of fun because you get to work with, instead of one composer, you're working with, I think we had 5 total, Morgan, or is it 6? 5 or 6? I can't remember.
6 if you include the folk song.
The folk song, right? Yeah. So, and part of the idea of doing that was really to use the music to reinforce the idea that every part of the film is pushing the time period forward, right? So we started off with kind of medieval sounding music. There's actually a piece in there that, unless the composer was pulling my leg, he had based it on like a medieval folk song about the Black Plague, right? That he wrote it during COVID, and he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna riff on this old song about the Black Death." That I think is in the throne room scene with Patton. So we started there, and then from there tried to like move the sonic landscape, the sonic soundscape forward. So we're going from that medieval sound, until eventually we're in sort of like a synthesizer, vaguely futuristic place. Yeah. So
you work on the film for 7 years. It premieres earlier in 2021 at I believe South by Southwest was the world premiere.
Yep.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, that festival was all virtual. Is that correct?
It was. Yes.
All right. So you've made this film. You spent years working on this film. You're having the world premiere. You don't get to be there with an audience. You have to do it virtually. I mean, it is what it is. That's the way the world was for a while. Were there, and I know you played other festivals since too, and most of those, a lot of those were virtual. Have you gotten to see the film with an audience, either at a festival or once it got picked up for theatrical distribution? Have you gotten to experience the film with an audience, and what was that like, seeing it with an audience? Your baby that you worked on for some.
It was incredible. Yes, we missed a lot of in-person festivals, but there was just this perfect little window of time where vaccinations are good, COVID was diminished, and we managed to slip over to the Telluride Horror Show in Colorado, which was, a fantastic venue to see anything. It's right at, it's up in the snowy mountains, and it's all, all horror films. So it was wonderful, and they're very accommodating. But we had the big screen, we had the big one, and we got to sit up on the balcony and watch it. And it was a good room. It was the first time I'd heard someone sort of do a sharp intake of breath when someone's gruesomely murdered. Larry's death, ultimately, I think people clapped at that one. Because it was, I think it's just so exciting when it happens. So that always gets a good crowd reaction. It was amazing. I mean, in a sense, so much of what's really compulsive about making things, at least for me, is like as much time as it takes. Like if you can then spend that much time back with so many other people's lives, 93 minutes at a time. I feel like there's like a trade-off of that, where you're just getting to take a piece of yourself and your mind and share it in, almost in dialogue with countless people. But in the actual theater, it was incredible.
Larry, have you gotten a chance to see it, the completed film?
No, not in the theater and not the whole movie. So I get to wait. I'm gonna get my Blu-ray and watch it on my big TV.
I was gonna say we should have sent you a screener. I'm so sorry. I will buy you a Blu-ray.
Well, the film seems to be connecting with audiences. It got picked up for theatrical distribution fairly early in the process, and Shudder, the streaming service Shudder, will also be streaming the film on its site. Do we have a date on that?
It's in March. The actual date, they said March 24th, but then they also said, but we're not 100% sure of that. So we'll say March.
First quarter 2022 sometime. Yeah. I know that there's a lot of positive reaction. When I posted on Facebook the other night when I was watching the film that I was watching it, and I got comments from friends like, "Oh, this is my #1 movie of the year that I've seen so far." I know it played at Alamo Draft House here in town in early November, and the programmer there, it says that's one of his favorite films of the year. So I know it's connecting positively with a lot of audience from those in-person screenings, and from maybe people that you met or people that you're reading online. Are you getting a sense of who the demographic is for this film? Is it old school kids that grew up in the 70s and 80s that miss this type of film, or is it newer kids who maybe haven't even seen heavy metal, haven't seen Fire to Ice? They're looking at The Spine of Night, and to them, it looks so different that, like, even though it's old school, it's like brand new, like wowing them. Is it younger people, older people, mixed combination of the two?
I mean, I feel like our the website stats and like YouTube stats tend to show that it's people about our age, like men largely around our age. So I'm guessing it's a lot of that. But I mean, in person, I've met people of all ages, and online, there's this guy, Joel Haver, who does it's sort of rotoscope-ish style stuff that's very popular on Instagram and TikTok. I wasn't even aware of him until people started asking if I knew who he was. But he's got his like it's not a hand drawn technique that he's doing, but he's doing like fantasy rotoscope ish like comedy shorts. And so I mean it's a whole generation of people who like don't have any reference except for his work. Like they don't know Bakshi at all, but they know this guy. And so I've plenty of people have been like, oh, it's like that, but serious. So I think it reaches a broader demographic. It's hard to know. It's hard to know.
I mean, like you say, in the in-person screenings in Colorado, it was notable to me at least that like people came up to talk to us afterwards, and I mean, I'd like to think we made a movie for men and women, but in particular at those screenings, there were a number of women who came up and were like, "Oh, that it really spoke to them." In particular, the Lucy Lawless character, they were all nerdy. They were like, "Oh, that is my D&D character. Like, thank you for putting that on screen," which was really heartening because again, you don't, at least I think Morgan and I both don't just want to make movies for people who are exactly like us. You want to make them for everybody. So for everybody who might be at least somewhat interested in an ultra-violent, naked fantasy film. So
that's a hope.
I have a prediction. I think at worst case scenario, in 10, 20, 30 years, your film's still going to be shown in theaters, midnight shows, once a year, repertory screenings at Alamo Draft Houses and New Beverly Cinemas and whatever in the future exists that are like that. I think it's going to build over time for sure, and people are going to discover it. And like I said, it sounds like the reactions so far are extremely positive. We are out of time, sadly. But Morgan, Philip, and Larry, I want to thank you so much for talking with us today on Cherry the Geek TV. The film is called The Spine of Night. You can rent it and buy it on your video on demand platforms, and it will be on the Shudder app sometime early 2022. Guys, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.